Shalom. If your financial stress never fully goes away, it's not because you're anxious, it's because something is out of order. You know the feeling, that constant pressure in your chest when you think about money, the anxiety that follows you from paycheck to paycheck, even when the numbers in your account grow. The stress that persists despite every raise, every promotion, every financial milestone you achieve. Most people assume this stress is emotional. They think it stems from fear, insecurity, or psychological patterns that need therapeutic intervention. Torah never treats stress as an emotional problem. It treats it as a signal that order is missing. When the structure of your financial life is misaligned, stress appears as information, not as weakness. The anxiety you feel is not a character flaw requiring motivation or a mindset requiring adjustment. It is data indicating that somewhere in your system, disorder has taken root. Today we examine why financial stress never stops through the lens of Torah's law of order, and why the solution lies not in managing feelings but in restoring structural alignment. The prevailing approach to financial stress treats it as a psychological condition. People seek comfort, reassurance, and emotional strategies to cope with what they perceive as an internal struggle. They attend seminars about abundance mindset, practice gratitude exercises, or try to convince themselves that money is not important. When stress returns, they assume they need more therapy, stronger willpower, or deeper inner work. This cycle continues indefinitely because the fundamental diagnosis is incorrect. Consider what happens when someone receives a salary increase. Initially, the stress seems to diminish. The person feels relief, believing they have solved their financial problems. Within weeks or months, however, the anxiety returns, new expenses arise, lifestyle inflation occurs. The same feelings of pressure and uncertainty resurface despite the improved financial position. The standard explanation attributes this to hedonic adaptation or psychological patterns of never having enough. These explanations miss the underlying structural reality. The stress returns because the increase in income was not accompanied by an increase in order. The person's financial structure, their system of obligations, boundaries, and responsibilities remained fundamentally unchanged. More money flowed through the same disordered system, creating new forms of imbalance. The stress was never about the amount of money. It was about the absence of proper structure to manage whatever amount existed. People attempt various emotional solutions to financial stress. They practice visualization, hoping to manifest abundance. They repeat affirmations about deserving wealth. They try to release limiting beliefs about money through psychological techniques. They seek motivation from success stories or inspirational content. None of these approaches address the fundamental issue because none of them recognize that stress is structural information, not emotional dysfunction. A person's income increases, but their obligations increase faster than their structure. More payments, more commitments, more pressure. The stress does not come from fear or mindset. It comes from disorder. The system is carrying more load than it was built to support. Torah approaches stress through the principle of seder, which means order. This is not organizational advice or time management. Seder represents the fundamental law that all systems must maintain proper sequence, hierarchy, and boundaries to function correctly. When seder is present, each element of a system operates within its designated role and capacity. When seder is absent, stress appears as a natural consequence of misalignment. In the context of financial life, seder means that income, expenses, obligations, and goals exist in proper relationship to each other. Your earning capacity aligns with your spending patterns. Your financial obligations remain within the bounds of your actual resources. Your future goals correspond to realistic timelines and available means. When these elements are properly ordered, the system functions smoothly. When they are disordered, stress emerges as inevitable feedback. The Mishnah teaches that a person should not take upon themselves obligations they cannot fulfill. This principle extends beyond moral commitments to practical financial structures. When someone commits to expenses that exceed their sustainable income, when they establish financial goals that ignore their actual capacity, when they blur the boundaries between necessities and desires, they create structural disorder. The stress that follows is not emotional weakness, but systemic feedback indicating that correction is needed. Torah views stress as information similar to how a fever indicates infection in the body. The fever itself is not the problem requiring treatment. It is a signal that the body's systems are responding to disorder. Similarly, financial stress signals that somewhere in your economic structure, elements are operating outside their proper boundaries. The solution involves identifying and correcting the structural misalignment, not managing the emotional symptoms. This diagnostic approach explains why financial stress often increases during periods of economic growth. When income rises but structure remains disordered, the system processes more resources through the same flawed patterns. A person who overspends relative to a modest income will likely overspend relative to a larger income. Someone who fails to maintain boundaries between necessary and optional expenses will struggle with the same boundaries regardless of their wealth level. The stress intensifies because more resources are now subject to the same structural problems. Consider how this differs from the emotional interpretation of financial stress. The emotional model suggests that stress stems from fear, greed, insecurity, or other psychological states that can be addressed through inner work. The structural model recognizes that stress emerges from concrete imbalances in how resources, obligations, and capacities relate to each other. These imbalances can be measured, analyzed, and corrected through systematic changes in financial structure. The binary that governs our understanding is clear. Either stress is emotional, requiring psychological intervention and coping strategies, or stress is structural, requiring systematic correction of disorder. These two approaches lead to entirely different solutions. The emotional approach focuses on changing feelings, thoughts, and internal states. The structural approach focuses on aligning external systems according to principles of order. When stress is treated as emotional, the solutions involve managing psychological responses to financial circumstances. People learn to cope with anxiety, practice acceptance of their situation, or work to change their relationship with money through therapy or spiritual practices. These approaches may provide temporary relief, but they do not address the underlying structural issues that generate stress in the first place. When stress is treated as structural, the solutions involve examining and correcting the actual organization of financial resources and obligations. This means ensuring that expenses align with sustainable income levels, that financial commitments remain within realistic boundaries, that future goals correspond to available means and timeframes. The focus shifts from managing emotional responses to establishing proper order in the concrete elements of financial life. The practical implications of this binary are significant. Someone operating from the emotional model might respond to financial stress by practicing gratitude for their current income, visualizing future abundance, or working to release fears about money. Someone operating from the structural model would examine their actual financial structure, Identify specific areas where obligations exceed capacity and implement concrete changes to restore balance. For example, a person experiencing stress about monthly expenses might use emotional strategies to feel better about their spending patterns. They might practice acceptance of their current situation or work to develop a more positive relationship with money. The structural approach would involve analyzing whether monthly obligations actually exceed monthly income, whether optional expenses have been confused with necessary ones, and whether financial boundaries have been properly established and maintained. The distinction extends to how we understand financial planning and goal setting. The emotional approach encourages people to dream big, visualize success, and maintain positive attitudes about their financial future regardless of their current circumstances. The structural approach emphasizes establishing goals that correspond to actual capacity, creating realistic timelines based on available resources, and maintaining proper proportion between current obligations and future aspirations. This does not mean accepting limitations or thinking small. It means ensuring that financial structures can support whatever level of growth or achievement is pursued. A person with proper structural order can scale their financial capacity systematically without creating the stress that comes from misaligned obligations and resources. Growth occurs within the bounds of sustainable structure rather than in opposition to structural principles. The persistence of financial stress, despite increasing income, becomes clear when viewed structurally. Income growth that is not accompanied by structural improvement simply scales existing disorder. More money flows through the same misaligned patterns, creating new forms of imbalance. The stress continues because the fundamental structural issues remain unaddressed. Many people intuitively recognize this pattern but misinterpret its meaning. They notice that higher income does not eliminate financial stress and conclude that money is not important or that they should focus on non-material sources of satisfaction. This conclusion misses the structural diagnosis. The problem is not that money is unimportant, but that their financial structure lacks proper order. With correct structure, increased resources would reduce rather than perpetuate stress. Torah's approach to financial order involves several key principles. First, obligations must remain within the bounds of sustainable capacity. This means that regular expenses should not exceed regular income, that financial commitments should be based on realistic assessments of available resources, and that growth in obligations should correspond to growth in capacity to fulfill them. Second, boundaries must be maintained between different categories of financial activity. Necessary expenses must be distinguished from optional ones. Short-term obligations must be separated from long-term goals. Emergency resources must be protected from routine spending. When these boundaries become blurred, structural disorder results. Third, financial decisions must be made according to actual rather than projected circumstances. Plans should be based on current resources and demonstrated earning patterns rather than optimistic assumptions about future income. Goals should reflect realistic timelines and available means rather than idealized outcomes. These are not coping tools or psychological strategies. They are order corrections based on structural principles. Their purpose is not to help you feel better about financial stress, but to eliminate the structural conditions that generate stress in the first place. When financial structure aligns with these principles, stress naturally recedes because the system operates within sustainable boundaries. The implementation of structural corrections requires specific attention to concrete details. Begin by documenting actual income and expenses over a meaningful time period. This provides accurate information about current financial patterns rather than assumptions or estimates. Identify obligations that exceed sustainable capacity and develop plans to bring them into alignment with available resources. Establish clear boundaries between necessary and optional expenses. Necessary expenses are those required to maintain basic life functions and fulfill existing commitments. Optional expenses are those that enhance quality of life but are not required for basic functioning. When optional expenses are treated as necessary ones, structural disorder results. Create realistic timelines for financial goals based on demonstrated capacity rather than desired outcomes. If your current rate of saving allows for a particular goal to be achieved in 5 years, do not create stress by insisting it must happen in 2 years. Allow goals to align with capacity rather than forcing capacity to stretch beyond sustainable limits. Maintain emergency reserves that remain separate from regular spending patterns. These reserves should not be considered available for routine expenses or optional purchases. Their purpose is to provide structural stability when unexpected financial obligations arise. Without proper reserves, any financial disruption creates systemic stress. Review financial commitments regularly to ensure they continue to align with current capacity and circumstances. Commitments that made sense under previous conditions may no longer be sustainable under current ones. Regular review allows for systematic adjustment rather than crisis-driven changes. These corrections address the structural roots of financial stress rather than its emotional symptoms. Their effectiveness depends not on how they make you feel, but on how they align your financial obligations with your actual capacity to fulfill them. When this alignment is achieved, stress recedes naturally because the system no longer operates under conditions of structural disorder. The contrast between structural and emotional approaches extends to how we understand financial setbacks and challenges. The emotional model treats financial difficulties as tests of character, opportunities for growth, or experiences that require psychological processing. The structural model treats them as information about system vulnerabilities that need correction. When someone experiences a financial setback, the emotional response might involve accepting the situation, finding meaning in the struggle, or maintaining hope for future improvement. The structural response involves analyzing what system failures allowed the setback to occur, identifying structural weaknesses that need strengthening, and implementing changes to prevent similar problems in the future. This difference in approach affects long-term financial stability. Emotional strategies may provide comfort during difficult periods, but do not necessarily prevent future difficulties. Structural corrections address the underlying conditions that create vulnerability to financial disruption. By strengthening the system itself, structural approaches provide lasting protection rather than temporary relief. The principle of seder also applies to financial decision-making processes. Decisions should be made according to established criteria rather than emotional impulses or external pressures. When clear standards exist for evaluating financial choices, decisions become more consistent and predictable. When decisions are made emotionally, they often conflict with each other and create systematic disorder. For example, establish specific criteria for major purchases based on income levels, existing obligations, and available reserves. When a potential purchase meets these criteria, it can be made confidently. When it does not meet the criteria, it should be declined regardless of emotional desire or external pressure. This systematic approach prevents the accumulation of financial obligations that exceed structural capacity. Similarly, establish clear processes for evaluating financial opportunities. Whether considering investments, career changes, or business ventures, use consistent criteria based on realistic assessment of risks, required resources, and potential outcomes. Emotional enthusiasm or fear should not override systematic evaluation based on structural principles. The Torah concept of seder suggests that financial order must be actively maintained rather than assumed. Just as physical systems require regular maintenance to function properly, financial systems require ongoing attention to maintain proper structure. This means regularly reviewing and adjusting financial arrangements to ensure they continue to serve their intended purposes. Monthly review of expenses ensures that spending patterns remain aligned with income and goals. Annual review of larger financial commitments ensures that they continue to fit within overall financial structure. Regular assessment of financial goals ensures that they remain realistic given current circumstances and demonstrated progress. This ongoing maintenance prevents the gradual accumulation of disorder that leads to financial stress. Small misalignments can be corrected before they compound into larger structural problems. Regular attention to financial order prevents crisis situations that require dramatic corrective measures. The effectiveness of structural approaches can be measured objectively. When financial structure improves, specific indicators change in measurable ways. The ratio of expenses to income moves towards sustainable levels. Emergency reserves grow to appropriate levels. Financial goals align with realistic timelines. These changes can be documented and tracked over time. Emotional approaches to financial stress often produce subjective improvements that are difficult to measure and may not correspond to actual changes in financial circumstances. Someone might feel better about their financial situation through psychological work while their actual financial structure remains unchanged. The structural approach prioritizes measurable improvements in actual financial conditions over subjective improvements in emotional responses. This measurement capability allows for systematic improvement over time. As structural corrections are implemented, their effects can be observed and evaluated. Successful changes can be maintained and extended. Unsuccessful changes can be modified or replaced. The process becomes systematic rather than random. The long-term goal of structural financial work is the establishment of sustainable order that reduces rather than eliminates financial decision-making. When proper structure exists, most financial choices become clear and automatic. Monthly expenses are predetermined within established boundaries. Savings occur according to systematic plans. Major purchases are evaluated according to established criteria. This does not eliminate financial choices, but reduces the number of decisions that must be made from first principles. The cognitive and emotional energy previously devoted to constant financial decision-making becomes available for other purposes. Financial stress decreases not because problems are avoided, but because systems exist to handle them effectively. Torah does not treat stress as a feeling to manage. It treats it as a signal of disorder. Financial anxiety persists not because of psychological patterns or emotional dysfunction, but because financial obligations and resources exist in misaligned relationships. The solution involves structural correction rather than emotional intervention. Restore order and stress recedes.